the passing of Mrs. Whitcomb. The news spread through St. Mary Mead with the soft inevitability of falling rain. Mrs. Whitcomb has passed away. It was said quietly at first, at the baker's shop in hushed tones outside the post office, and later more openly as the morning advanced. By noon, the entire village knew. Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb had been found in her sitting room, seated in her favourite armchair by the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap. There had been no sign of distress, no overturned furniture, no indication of pain. The doctor, summoned promptly, had given the cause of death as heart failure. She went peacefully, people said, just as one would hope. And indeed, if one were to choose a way to depart this world, Mrs. Whitcomb's seemed almost ideal. Miss Marple heard the news from her maid, Florence, Tom, who came in carrying the morning tray with a rather solemn expression. "Terrible thing, miss. Mrs. Whitcomb. Gone in the night, they say." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting, her needles pausing mid-motion. "Dear Mrs. Whitcomb," she said gently. "How very sad." Florence nodded eagerly, pleased to be the bearer of information. "Dr. Haynes says it was her heart. Just like that. Mrs. Clark found her this morning when she came by with some jam." "Ah, yes. Mrs. Clark often visited," Miss Marple murmured. She resumed her knitting, though more slowly now, her thoughts turning inward. Mrs. Whitcomb. It was difficult to imagine St. Mary Mead without her. She had lived in the village for nearly 20 years and in that time had become something of an institution. She was the sort of woman who remembered birthdays, who delivered broth to the ill, who wrote letters for those who struggled with such things, and who always seemed to know exactly what was needed before anyone thought to ask. She was an angel, people said, and not without sincerity. Miss Marple herself had often remarked upon Mrs. Whitcomb's generosity, though she had never been quite so effusive in her praise as others. There had been, perhaps, something a little excessive about it. But that was hardly a thought one voiced, particularly not on the morning of the woman's death. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple found herself walking slowly down the high street, her knitting left behind for the moment. Such occasions, she felt, required a certain presence. One did not remain at home when the village was in mourning. Outside the grocer's she encountered Mrs. Price Ridley, who was already deep in conversation with Mr. Ellis, the chemist. "My dear Miss Marple," Mrs. Price Ridley exclaimed, seizing upon her at once, "have you heard the dreadful news?" "Yes, indeed," Miss Marple replied. "A great loss to us all." "Such a kind soul," Mrs. Price Ridley continued, pressing a hand to her chest. "Always thinking of others. I can't imagine anyone who had a bad word to say about her." Mr. Ellis nodded gravely. "She was in only last week," he said, "buying something for Mrs. Turner's rheumatism. Said she'd noticed the poor woman was struggling with her hands." "Always noticing," Mrs. Price Ridley said with admiration. Miss Marple inclined her head politely. "Yes," she said, "always noticing." There was a brief pause. Something, very slight, passed between them, though it would have been difficult to say exactly what. Then Mrs. Price Ridley hurried on, eager to share her grief with others. Miss Marple continued her walk. Mrs. Whitcomb's cottage stood near the edge of the village, a charming little place with whitewashed walls and a carefully tended garden. Even now, despite the sombre occasion, the flowers were in perfect order, tulips standing upright, as though determined to maintain their dignity. A small cluster of villagers had gathered outside, speaking in subdued voices. Miss Marple approached quietly. Inside she could see Mrs. Clark moving about with purposeful efficiency. Mrs. Clark, a stout and capable woman, had long been one of Mrs. Whitcomb's closest companions. She had been the one to discover the body that morning, and already she had taken charge of the practical arrangements. "She's in there, Miss Marple," Mrs. Clark said when she noticed her. "Just as peaceful as you please, like she's only resting." Miss Marple hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "If it wouldn't be too much trouble." "Of course not," Mrs. Clark said quickly. "You'd want to pay your respects." The sitting room was exactly as one might expect. Neat, orderly, comfortable. Mrs. Whitcomb sat in her chair by the window, her expression serene. A book lay open on the small table beside her, as though she had only just set it down. Miss Marple stood for a moment, her gaze resting on the still figure. "Yes," she said softly, "very peaceful." And yet, it was a curious thing. Miss Marple could not have said at that moment what troubled her. There was nothing outwardly amiss, everything was precisely as it should be. And still, a faint unease stirred somewhere at the back of her mind. As she turned to leave, she noticed Mrs. Clark watching her rather closely. "Strange, isn't it?" Mrs. Clark said. "One minute she's here, the next." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. Mrs. Clark hesitated, then added, "She did so much for everyone. I don't know how we'll manage without her." There was something in her tone, not grief exactly, but something more complicated, something that flickered briefly and was gone. Miss Marple met her eyes. "I'm sure the village will find its way," she said gently. Mrs. Clark gave a short, almost abrupt nod. "Yes, of course." Later that evening, as Miss Marple sat once more by her fire, her knitting resting in her lap, she found her thoughts returning again and again to Mrs. Whitcomb. Kindness, she reflected, was generally considered the simplest of virtues, and yet, in her experience, it was rarely simple at all. There were different kinds of kindness. Some were light and unassuming, given freely and forgotten just as easily. Others had a way of binding people, of creating obligations, of lingering. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she resumed her work. "Yes," she murmured to herself, "very kind indeed." But her eyes, sharp despite their gentle appearance, were thoughtful, and far from at rest. A village in mourning. In the days that followed, St. Mary Mead seemed wrapped in a peculiar stillness, as though the village itself had paused to take stock of its loss. Curtains were drawn a little earlier than usual, voices lowered instinctively, and even the children, who could rarely be relied upon for sustained solemnity, played with an unusual quietness along the hedgerows. Mrs. Whitcomb's death had touched everyone. The church bell tolled slowly on the morning after her passing, its measured sound carrying across fields and cottages alike. It was not merely a signal of death, it was a reminder of presence now gone. Miss Marple, seated by her window, listened with her head slightly inclined, her hands folded in her lap. "Such a gentlewoman," Florence said from the doorway, her voice thick with emotion. "There's not a soul in this village she didn't help at one time or another." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Yes, Florence, that is quite true." But even as she spoke, her mind was occupied not only with Mrs. Whitcomb's kindness, but with its reach. It had been extensive. The funeral was arranged swiftly, as was customary. Mrs. Whitcomb, it seemed, had left her affairs in exemplary order. Instructions had been written neatly, almost methodically, in a small leather-bound notebook found on her writing desk. Even in death she had ensured that no one would be inconvenienced. "That was just like her," Mrs. Price Ridley remarked to anyone who would listen, "thinking of others to the very last." Miss Marple, who had been shown the notebook briefly by the vicar, had turned its pages with interest. Lists, names, small notations in tidy handwriting. "Mrs. Turner, send broth twice weekly. Mr. Ellis, remind him about his sister's birthday. Mrs. Clark, must not overexert herself." Miss Marple had paused at that last entry, her eyes lingering on it for a fraction longer than necessary. "Remarkably thorough," she had said. "Yes," the vicar had agreed warmly. A most conscientious lady." Miss Marple had smiled faintly, but had said nothing further. On the morning of the funeral, the sky was pale and overcast, the sort of soft grey that seemed fitting for the occasion. The entire village gathered at the church, some out of genuine affection, others perhaps out of habit, but all united in appearance. Miss Marple arrived early, taking her usual seat not too far from the front. From there she had an excellent view of those entering. Mrs. Clark came in first, dressed in deep black, her expression composed but rather rigid. She nodded to acquaintances but did not linger in conversation. Behind her came Mr. Ellis, looking uncharacteristically subdued, followed by Mrs. Turner, who leaned heavily on her cane and dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "She was so good to me, Mrs." Turner whispered to anyone nearby, "I don't know what I shall do now." Miss Marple observed her quietly. Dependence, she thought. It was not an unkind thought, but it was a precise one. The service itself was simple and dignified. The vicar spoke movingly of Mrs. Whitcomb's generosity, her selflessness, her unwavering attention to the needs of others. "A rare soul," he said, "one who gave without expectation." There was a murmur of agreement throughout the church. Miss Marple sat very still. Without expectation, she wondered? Human nature, she reflected, seldom operated without expectation, though those expectations were not always obvious, even to the person who held them. Her gaze shifted slightly as she noticed Mrs. Clark again. The woman's hands were clasped tightly in her lap. Her knuckles were pale, almost white. Her expression was composed, yes, but there was something else there too, not grief alone, something sharper. After the service, the villagers gathered outside in small clusters, speaking in low tones. There was, as always, a certain amount of practical discussion beneath the expressions of sorrow. Who will take over her visits? Mrs. Turner will need someone to check on her. And the children, she used to help them with their lessons. Miss Marple listened as she moved among them, offering quiet words where appropriate. It was Mrs. Clark who approached her at last. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice polite but somewhat strained. "A sad day." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied gently. Mrs. Clark hesitated, then said, "She meant a great deal to you, I think." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "As she did to many," she said. "Yes, Mrs. Clark agreed quickly. "To many." There was that same flicker again. Something unspoken, something carefully held in check. Miss Marple regarded her thoughtfully. "You were very close to her," she said. Mrs. Clark's lips pressed together. "Yes," she said after a moment. "Very close." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. It was Mr. Leonard Briggs, a quiet, somewhat reserved man who lived near the far end of the village. He was not known for social calls, and his presence at her door was, in itself, noteworthy. "Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat nervously, "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," Miss Marple replied, ushering him inside. "Do come in." He sat rather stiffly in the chair opposite her, his hands clasped together. "It's about Mrs. Whitcomb," he began. "Yes?" Miss Marple said. Her tone encouraging. He hesitated. "Well, it's just that everyone says it was her heart." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "And I suppose that's right," he continued quickly. "Dr. Haynes would know." "Indeed." There was a pause. "But," Mr. Briggs said at last, lowering his voice slightly, "it did seem sudden." Miss Marple's eyes rested on him quietly. "Sudden," she repeated. "Yes. I saw her the day before. She seemed quite well. Better than usual, in fact." "Better?" Miss Marple echoed. "Yes. Quite cheerful. Almost relieved, if you understand me." Miss Marple did not respond immediately. Relieved. It was not, she thought, the word one usually associated with Mrs. Whitcomb. "And did she say anything of note?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mr. Briggs frowned slightly, as though trying to recall. "No, nothing in particular. Only she did say something rather odd." "Oh?" He shifted in his seat. "She said, 'It will all be settled soon.'" Miss Marple's knitting lay forgotten in her lap. "Indeed," she said softly. After Mr. Briggs had gone, Miss Marple sat for a long time without moving. The room was quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. "It will all be settled soon." Such a curious remark. And then there was that list, those careful notations, the subtle tension in Mrs. Clark's voice, the peculiar restraint in the grief of others. Miss Marple reached for her knitting at last, though her hands moved more slowly than usual. "Yes," she murmured, "very curious indeed." For beneath the surface of sorrow something else had begun to take shape, something faint, something easily overlooked, but not, Miss Marple suspected, insignificant, and certainly not accidental. Small habits and subtle threads. Miss Marple had always maintained that truth, like a well-hidden stitch in embroidery, revealed itself not through grand gestures, but through the smallest, most consistent details. It was in habits, those quiet, repeated actions, that one could often glimpse the true nature of a person. And Mrs. Whitcomb, she reflected, had been a woman of habits, very particular habits. The following morning dawned clear and bright, as though the village had decided, after its brief period of mourning, to resume its ordinary rhythm. Windows were opened, rugs shaken, and the comforting routine of daily life began again. Miss Marple, however, was not one to be hurried by appearances. After finishing her breakfast, and she put on her hat with deliberate care and set out for a walk, not aimlessly, but with quiet intention. Her first stop was Mrs. Turner's cottage. Mrs. Turner lived in a narrow, ivy-covered house just off the lane, and she answered the door with visible effort, leaning heavily on her cane. "Miss Marple," she said, surprised. "How kind of you to come." "My dear Mrs. Turner," Miss Marple replied warmly, "I thought I might see how you were managing." Mrs. Turner sighed, ushering her inside. "Not very well, I'm afraid," she said. "Everything feels different." Miss Marple seated herself comfortably. "I imagine it must," she said gently. Mrs. Turner sank into her chair. "She used to come every Tuesday and Friday," she continued, "always at the same time. Brought me broth or sometimes cake. Said I needed keeping up." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. She was very attentive." Mrs. Turner gave a small, weary smile. "She never forgot anything. Not once. If I so much as mentioned a pain in my hand, she'd arrive the next day with ointment." There was a pause. "It was a comfort," Mrs. Turner added. Miss Marple observed her carefully. "And now?" she asked. Mrs. Turner hesitated. "Well, now I suppose I shall have to manage on my own." Her tone was neutral, but there was something beneath it. A faint uncertainty, perhaps even a trace of resentment. Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Yes," she said, "that can be an adjustment." From Mrs. Turner's, Miss Marple made her way to the High Street, where she found Mr. Ellis in his chemist's shop, rearranging bottles with unnecessary precision. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, though his voice lacked its usual cheerfulness. "Good morning, Mr. Ellis." She selected a small item from the counter, more out of politeness than necessity, and brought it to him. "A sad loss for the village," she said. "Yes," he replied quickly. "Very sad." He wrapped her purchase with care, avoiding her gaze. "She was always so thoughtful," Miss Marple continued. "Yes," he said again. "Always." There was a brief silence. "She used to remind me of things," he added suddenly. "Birthdays, appointments, even stock orders once or twice." "How very helpful," Miss Marple remarked. Mr. Ellis gave a short laugh. "Yes, helpful." The word seemed to linger in the air. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "And you found that reassuring?" she asked. Mr. Ellis hesitated. "Well, yes, of course." But his tone suggested something less certain. "Though," he added after a moment, "one does like to manage one's own affairs, doesn't one?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Indeed," she said. By the time Miss Marple reached Mrs. Clark's house, the morning had advanced considerably. She found the woman in her garden, trimming a rose bush with decisive, almost aggressive movements. "Good morning, Mrs. Clark," Miss Marple called. Mrs. Clark straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "Miss Marple," she said, "out for a walk?" "Yes. I thought I might call on you." Mrs. Clark nodded, though she did not appear particularly pleased. "Well, come in then." The sitting room was neat, though not quite as immaculate as Mrs. Whitcomb's had been. There was a sense of lived-in comfort, but also of something slightly strained, as though order had been imposed rather than naturally maintained. Miss Marple took her seat. "You must be very tired," she said kindly. "After everything." Mrs. Clark shrugged. "There's been a lot to do." "I'm sure." A pause followed. "You and Mrs. Whitcomb were great friends," Miss Marple said. Mrs. Clark's lips tightened. "Yes." "You saw her often?" "Every day," Mrs. Clark replied shortly. Miss Marple's gaze rested on her. "Every day," she repeated. "Yes," Mrs. Clark said. "She relied on me for a good many things." There was a slight emphasis on the word relied. "And you on her?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Clark looked at her sharply. "I don't see what you mean." Miss Marple's expression remained mild, only that such close friendships are often mutual. Mrs. Clark gave a short laugh. "Well, she liked to be helpful," she said. "It gave her purpose." Miss Marple said nothing. "She couldn't bear the idea of being unnecessary," Mrs. Clark continued, her voice taking on a slightly brittle edge. "Always had to be doing something for someone." There was silence for a moment. Then Mrs. Clark seemed to realize she had said too much. "Not that there was anything wrong with that," she added quickly. "Of course not," Miss Marple said. As Miss Marple rose to leave, her eyes fell briefly on a small table near the window. Upon it lay a familiar object, a notebook, not identical to the one found in Mrs. Whitcomb's house, but very similar in size and appearance. Mrs. Clark followed her gaze and moved swiftly to pick it up. "Just my own notes," she said. Miss Marple smiled politely. "How very sensible," she said. That afternoon, Miss Marple sat in her garden, her knitting once again in her hands. The sun was warm, the air filled with the scent of blooming flowers. To any casual observer, it was a perfectly ordinary day. But Miss Marple's mind was far from idle. Patterns, she thought. There were patterns here. Mrs. Whitcomb had not merely been kind, she had been involved, deeply involved, in the lives of many people. She had remembered things for them, managed things for them, anticipated their needs. And in doing so, Miss Marple's needles paused. Yes, in doing so, she had made herself indispensable. Indispensable, Miss Marple repeated softly. It was a dangerous position to occupy, for when one person became indispensable, others often became dependent. And dependence, she knew, was rarely a simple emotion. It could bring comfort, certainly, but also frustration, resentment, even in some cases. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her expression thoughtful. Relief, she murmured. Mr. Briggs had said that Mrs. Whitcomb had seemed relieved. Relieved of what? And then there was Mrs. Clark, her tone, her tension, that curious sharpness beneath her grief. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the horizon. Yes, she said quietly. Something was changing. Something had been about to change, and if Mrs. Whitcomb had truly believed that, it would all be settled soon. Then whatever had been building beneath the surface of St. Mary Mead had not been accidental. It had been leading somewhere final, the weight of kindness. It was one of Miss Marple's firmest beliefs that no human relationship was ever quite as simple as it appeared from the outside. Even the most harmonious arrangements, when examined closely, revealed small imbalances, subtle shifts of power and dependence that went unnoticed by all but the most observant. And in St. Mary Mead, where lives were closely intertwined, such imbalances had a way of growing quietly over time. The day after her visit to Mrs. Clark, Miss Marple received a note from the vicar, requesting her presence at the vicarage that afternoon. It was written in his usual warm and slightly hurried hand, but there was an undercurrent of curiosity in the invitation. Miss Marple arrived promptly at 4 o'clock. The vicar greeted her with evident relief. "My dear Miss Marple," he said, ushering her inside, "thank you for coming. I thought you might be able to offer a perspective." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I shall do my best." They settled in the sitting room where tea had already been laid out. The vicar poured with some distraction, clearly eager to speak. "It's about Mrs. Whitcomb," he said. "Or rather, about something that has come to light since her passing." Miss Marple waited patiently. The vicar reached for a small stack of papers on the table beside him. "These were found among her things," he explained. "Letters, unsent as far as we can tell." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her expression remained mild. "Unsent?" she repeated. "Yes, quite a number of them, addressed to various people in the village." He handed her the top one. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and began to read. The letter was addressed to Mrs. Turner. "My dear Mrs. Turner, I have been thinking very carefully about your situation. It seems to me that it would be best if you were to reduce your outings for a time. Your hands are not what they once were, and I fear you may do yourself harm if you persist in such exertions. I shall, of course, see to your needs personally. You need not trouble yourself further." Miss Marple read it through twice before placing it carefully back on the table. "How considerate," she said. The vicar shifted slightly. "Yes, though, well, there is a certain firmness in her tone, wouldn't you say?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "Indeed." The vicar handed her another letter. This one was addressed to Mr. Ellis. "Dear Mr. Ellis, I have noticed that your business arrangements have not been as orderly as they might be. You must allow me to assist you in maintaining proper records. It would be a shame if matters were to decline through inattention. I shall call tomorrow, and we will put things right." Miss Marple's lips pressed together very slightly. "Very thorough," she murmured. "Yes," the vicar said. "Quite." He hesitated before continuing. "There are several more in a similar vein." Miss Marple looked up. "And were any of these letters sent?" "No," he replied. "They were all found neatly arranged in a drawer." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "How curious." There was a silence in the room as both of them considered the implications. "At first I thought nothing of it," the vicar said at last. merely the natural concern of a kind-hearted woman. But now, he trailed off. "Yes?" Miss Marple prompted gently. "Well," he said, lowering his voice slightly, "it does suggest that Mrs. Whitcomb had rather strong ideas about how others should conduct their lives." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "My dear vicar," she said, that is not, in itself, a particularly rare trait." No, of course not," he agreed quickly. "But combined with her influence—" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes," she said, "combined with her influence." After leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple did not return home immediately. Instead, she took a longer route through the village, her thoughts turning over the letters she had just read. There had been kindness in them, certainly, but also something else: assumption, authority, an unspoken certainty that she knew best. Miss Marple had encountered such people before, those who, in their desire to help, gradually took it upon themselves to direct, to manage, to shape the lives of others. And often those others did not object. Not at first. It was easier, after all, to be guided than to take responsibility oneself. But over time— Miss Marple paused near the edge of the lane, her gaze distant. Over time, such guidance could become something rather heavier. Her reflections were interrupted by the sight of Mrs. Turner approaching slowly, her cane tapping against the ground. "Miss Marple," she called. "Out again?" "Yes, my dear," Miss Marple replied. "And you?" Mrs. Turner sighed. "I thought I'd try to manage a short walk, though I don't know why I bother. Mrs. Whitcomb would have told me to stay at home." There was a faint sharpness in her tone. Miss Marple looked at her thoughtfully. "And would you have agreed with her?" she asked. Mrs. Turner hesitated. "Well, I suppose I usually did." "Usually?" Miss Marple repeated. Mrs. Turner gave a small, rueful smile. She always seemed so certain. It was easier not to argue. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes," she said, "certainty can be very persuasive." As evening approached, Miss Marple found herself once again considering Mrs. Clark. There was something about that woman's manner that continued to trouble her. Not grief alone, not even strain. But something more contained, more deliberate. And so, the following morning she made her way once more to Mrs. Clark's house. This time she found Mrs. Clark indoors, seated at the table with a cup of tea. She looked up as Miss Marple entered, her expression guarded. "Miss Marple," she said, "back again." "I hope you don't mind," Miss Marple replied. "I felt we had not quite finished our conversation." Mrs. Clark gave a short laugh. "I don't recall that we began one." Miss Marple seated herself calmly. "On the contrary," she said, "I believe we began several." There was a brief silence. Then Mrs. Clark set down her cup with a small decisive movement. "What is it you want to know?" she asked. Miss Marple met her gaze. "Only this," she said gently. "Was Mrs. Whitcomb always as helpful as she appeared?" Mrs. Clark's lips tightened. "She meant well," she said. "That was not my question." Mrs. Clark looked away. For a moment it seemed as though she might refuse to answer. Then, quite suddenly, something in her expression shifted. "She liked to be needed," she said. Miss Marple said nothing. "She couldn't bear it if you didn't follow her advice," Mrs. Clark continued, her voice low but steady. "At first, it was small things, suggestions, reminders, and then—" She stopped. "And then?" Miss Marple prompted softly. Mrs. Clark let out a breath. "And then it was everything," she said. The room felt very still. "She decided what was best for you," Mrs. Clark went on. "What you should eat, what you should do, who you should see, and if you didn't agree—" Her voice faltered slightly. Miss Marple leaned forward. "What happened?" she asked. Mrs. Clark gave a short, humourless smile. "She would look at you," she said. "Not angrily, not even unkindly, just disappointed." Miss Marple's expression did not change. "And that was enough?" Mrs. Clark nodded. "Yes," she said quietly. "That was always enough." When Miss Marple left the house a short while later, her mind was clearer, but her unease had deepened. Kindness, she reflected, was rarely questioned. It was accepted, welcomed. And yet, when it crossed a certain line, when it began to impose rather than offer, it became something else entirely. Something more complicated. Something heavier. Miss Marple paused at the gate, her gaze thoughtful. "Yes," she murmured, "the weight of kindness." And she could not help but wonder, how heavy it had become for those who had lived under it, and whether, at last, someone had found it too much to bear. A quiet rebellion. In villages like St. Mary Mead, rebellion rarely announced itself with raised voices or dramatic gestures. It did not slam doors or storm out into the night. Instead, it moved quietly, like a shift in the wind, barely noticeable at first, but capable of altering everything in time. Miss Marple, as she returned home that afternoon, felt quite certain that such a shift had taken place. The difficulty, as always, lay in determining where it had begun. The following day brought with it an invitation of a different sort. Miss Marple was asked to tea at the home of Miss Emily Hartwell, a woman of gentle manners and delicate health, who had long been among Mrs. Whitcomb's most devoted recipients of care. "Dear Miss Marple," the note read, "I should be most grateful for your company. There are one or two things I feel I ought to discuss." Miss Marple accepted at once. Miss Hartwell's cottage was small but charming, filled with soft furnishings and the faint scent of lavender. She greeted Miss Marple with a nervous warmth, her hands fluttering slightly as she poured tea. "I do hope you'll forgive me for troubling you," she said, "but I find myself unsettled." Miss Marple regarded her kindly. "My dear Miss Hartwell, that is entirely understandable." Miss Hartwell sat opposite her, her expression troubled. "It's about Mrs. Whitcomb," she said. I feel as though I ought to be grieving more than I am." Miss Marple said nothing, allowing her to continue. "She was always so kind to me," Miss Hartwell went on. "She visited nearly every day, brought me books, arranged my medicines, even wrote letters on my behalf when I felt too tired." "That must have been a great comfort," Miss Marple said gently. "Yes," Miss Hartwell replied quickly. "Yes, it was." But her voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple's eyes rested on her thoughtfully. "And yet?" she prompted. Miss Hartwell looked down at her hands. "And yet, I sometimes felt as though I had no room to breathe," she said at last. The words hung in the air. Miss Marple did not react outwardly, but inwardly she noted them with great care. "No room to breathe," she repeated softly. Miss Hartwell nodded, her cheeks flushing slightly. "It sounds ungrateful, I know," she said quickly. "After all she did for me." "Not at all," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "Feelings are rarely so simple." Miss Hartwell gave her a grateful look. "She always knew what was best," she continued. "At least, she believed she did. If I disagreed, she would smile and say I didn't understand my own condition." Miss Marple's expression remained composed. "And did you?" Miss Hartwell hesitated. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "After a while one begins to doubt oneself." "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "That can happen." They spoke for some time after that, though Miss Hartwell seemed relieved simply to have voiced what had been troubling her. When Miss Marple rose to leave, the other woman accompanied her to the door. "There's one more thing," Miss Hartwell said, lowering her voice. Miss Marple paused. "Yes?" "The day before she died," Miss Hartwell said, "she came to see me, and she told me that things would soon be different." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. "Different," she repeated. "Yes, she said she had made arrangements, and that I would no longer need to concern myself with anything at all." Miss Marple was silent for a moment. "And how did you feel about that?" she asked. Miss Hartwell gave a small, uncertain laugh. "I didn't know what she meant," she said, "but I remember thinking, I didn't want everything arranged for me." As Miss Marple made her way home, her thoughts turned over this new information. Arrangements, settled soon, no longer needing to concern oneself. It painted a picture, one that was becoming increasingly distinct. Mrs. Whitcomb had not merely been kind. She had been planning something decisive. That afternoon, Miss Marple sat in her garden with her knitting, though her attention was divided. The threads of the case were beginning to align, but one element remained elusive. Motive, she thought, was rarely as straightforward as it appeared. Yes, there had been dependence. Yes, there had been pressure, even resentment. But resentment alone did not always lead to murder. There had to be something more immediate, something that had turned quiet discomfort into action. Her answer came sooner than expected. Florence entered the garden with a letter. "This just arrived for you, miss." Miss Marple took it with a nod. It was addressed in a neat but unfamiliar hand. Inside she found a single sheet of paper. "Miss Marple, you are asking questions. I believe I can provide you with information that may be of use. If you are willing, please call at my home this evening at 7. L.B. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the initials. L.B. Leonard Briggs. Mr. Briggs received her with visible nervousness. "I wasn't sure you would come," he said. "My dear Mr. Briggs," Miss Marple replied, "you suggested you had something to tell me." "Yes," he said quickly. "Yes, I do." He led her into his sitting room, where the curtains were already drawn, though the evening light had not yet faded. "I didn't want to say anything before," he began, not without being certain. "But now, well, I think it matters." Miss Marple seated herself calmly. "I am listening," she said. Mr. Briggs took a deep breath. "Mrs. Whitcomb came to see me 2 days before she died," he said. Miss Marple nodded slightly. "And?" "She asked me about my tenancy," he continued. "You see, I rent my house from her." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Indeed?" "Yes. And she told me that she intended to make some changes." "What sort of changes?" Miss Marple asked. Mr. Briggs swallowed. "She said she thought it would be better if I moved to a smaller place," he said. "That I wasn't making proper use of the house, and that someone else might benefit more from it." Miss Marple was very still. "And how did you respond?" she asked. "I told her I was quite content where I was," he said. "But she wouldn't hear of it. She said she had already begun making arrangements." There was a pause. "She spoke as though it were already decided," he added. Miss Marple folded her hands. "Yes," she said softly. "That does seem to have been her way." Mr. Briggs leaned forward slightly. "There's more," he said. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Go on." He hesitated, then said, "I later learned that she had spoken to others as well. Mrs. Turner, Miss Hartwell, even Mrs. Clark." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Mrs. Clark?" she repeated. "Yes. I overheard part of their conversation the day before." He stopped. "The day before her death?" Miss Marple prompted. Mr. Briggs nodded. "They were arguing," he said. The word seemed to settle heavily in the room. "Arguing?" Miss Marple repeated. "Yes," Mr. Briggs said. "Not loudly, but enough that I could hear through the open window." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "What did they say?" Mr. Briggs frowned, concentrating. "Mrs. Clark was upset," he said. "She kept saying, 'You can't just decide everything for everyone.' And Mrs. Whitcomb replied, 'Well,' as she said, 'it's for the best. You'll see that in time.'" Miss Marple was silent. "And then?" she asked. Mr. Briggs hesitated. "And then Mrs. Clark said something I didn't quite understand," he admitted. "She said, 'You won't be able to control things any more.'" When Miss Marple left Mr. Briggs's house that evening, the air had grown cool and the village lay in quiet darkness. But her mind was anything but still. Control, arrangements, decisions made without consent, and at last, resistance. Miss Marple walked slowly, her thoughts precise. "Yes," she murmured, "a quiet rebellion indeed." But rebellions, however quiet, often carried consequences, and in this case, they had ended in death. The night before, Miss Marple slept very little that night. It was not anxiety that kept her awake, but rather the steady, methodical turning of thoughts, each piece of information settling into place, each conversation echoing with slightly altered meaning. By the time the first light of morning filtered through her curtains, she felt certain of one thing. The answer lay not in what had happened over many years, but in what had changed in a single day. After breakfast, she set aside her knitting altogether, an unusual occurrence, and prepared to pay a visit to Dr. Haynes. If there was one person who could confirm whether Mrs. Whitcomb's death had been entirely natural, it would be him. Dr. Haynes was a practical man, not easily given to speculation. He greeted Miss Marple with polite surprise, though not, perhaps, with enthusiasm. "Miss Marple," he said, adjusting his spectacles, "what can I do for you?" "I wonder if I might trouble you with a few questions," she replied. He gestured for her to sit. "If this is about Mrs. Whitcomb," he said, "I can assure you there is nothing unusual to report. Her heart was not strong. It could have failed at any time." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Quite so," she said, "and yet, I understand she was in good spirits the day before her death." Dr. Haynes frowned slightly. "Yes, I saw her myself 3 days prior. She seemed improved, if anything." Improved? Miss Marple repeated. Yes. More energetic than I had seen her in some time. Miss Marple folded her hands. And in your professional opinion, Doctor, would a person in such a condition be likely to die so suddenly without any preceding distress? Dr. Haynes hesitated. Well, it is not impossible, he said. But I will admit, it is somewhat abrupt. Miss Marple's eyes rested on him quietly. And if, she said gently, there had been some external factor, something administered, for example, would you necessarily have detected it? Dr. Haynes sat up straighter. Are you suggesting? I am merely asking, Miss Marple said calmly. He considered for a moment. There are substances, he admitted at last, which could induce heart failure without leaving obvious signs, particularly in someone already predisposed. Miss Marple nodded. Thank you, Doctor, she said. That is most helpful. As she left the surgery, Miss Marple felt the last lingering doubt fall away. Yes, it had not been natural. It had been made to appear so. The question now was not how Mrs. Whitcomb had died, but why and by whom, and for that, she needed to understand the events of the final day. That afternoon she called once more upon Mrs. Clark. This time, however, she did not approach the matter gently. Mrs. Clark greeted her with visible impatience. Miss Marple, she said, I really don't see. I believe you do, Miss Marple interrupted quietly. There was something in her tone, firm, unmistakable, that caused Mrs. Clark to fall silent. Miss Marple stepped inside without waiting to be invited. I have spoken with Mr. Briggs, she said, and with Miss Hartwell and Mrs. Turner. I have also seen the letters Mrs. Whitcomb wrote. Mrs. Clark's face tightened. Then you know what she was like, she said shortly. Yes, Miss Marple replied. I believe I do. There was a pause. And I know that you argued with her the day before she died. Mrs. Clark's breath caught, almost imperceptibly. You've been listening to gossip, she said. No, Miss Marple said. I have been listening to truth, though it has been told in pieces. She moved a little closer. What happened that day, Mrs. Clark? She asked. For a moment it seemed as though Mrs. Clark might refuse to answer. Then, quite suddenly, her shoulders sagged. She came to see me in the afternoon, she said, just as she always did. Miss Marple waited. She had that look about her, Mrs. Clark continued, that determined look. I knew something was coming. What did she say? Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Clark let out a short, bitter laugh. She told me she had made arrangements for me, she said. Said it was time I had less to worry about. Miss Marple's eyes did not leave her face. And what did that mean? It meant, Mrs. Clark said sharply, that she had decided I should move. The words fell heavily. Move? Miss Marple repeated. Yes. She said this house was too much for me, that I was tiring myself out, that she had found a more suitable place. Miss Marple was silent. I told her I had no intention of leaving, Mrs. Clark went on, but she wouldn't listen. She said it was already arranged, that it would be for the best. Her hands clenched at her sides. She always said that, she added, as though that made it right. Miss Marple's voice was very quiet. And then? She asked. Mrs. Clark looked away, and then I told her she had no right, she said, that she couldn't keep deciding everything for everyone. Her voice trembled slightly now, not with grief, but with something long restrained. And she just smiled, she said. That same calm, certain smile, as though I were a child who didn't understand. Miss Marple said nothing. She said I would thank her later, Mrs. Clark continued. That I always did. There was a long pause, and that was when I realized. She stopped. Yes, Miss Marple prompted softly. Mrs. Clark turned back to her. That it would never stop, she said. The room seemed very still. She wasn't going to change, Mrs. Clark said. Not for me, not for anyone. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes, she said. I believe that is true. Mrs. Clark let out a breath. I felt as though I was being pushed out of my own life, she said, as though nothing I wanted mattered. Miss Marple's gaze softened. And what did you do? She asked. Mrs. Clark did not answer immediately. Instead, she moved to the window, her back to the room. I went home, she said at last. And that was all? Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Clark's shoulders stiffened. Yes, she said. Miss Marple watched her for a long moment. No, she said quietly. "I do not think that was all." Mrs. Clark did not turn around. "You returned later that evening," Miss Marple continued. "You had a key. You visited her often. It would not have seemed unusual. There was no response. You knew her habits," Miss Marple went on. "You knew she would be sitting in her chair. You knew she trusted you completely." Mrs. Clark's hands tightened on the windowsill. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "And you also knew," she said, "that there are certain substances which can bring about heart failure, particularly in someone already vulnerable." The silence that followed was absolute. At last, very slowly, Mrs. Clark turned around. Her face was pale, but composed. "You don't know that," she said. Miss Marple met her gaze. "No," she said, "but I know enough." There was a long pause. Then Mrs. Clark gave a small, almost weary smile. "She looked so peaceful," she said. Miss Marple did not speak. "I sat with her for a while," Mrs. Clark continued. "Afterward." Her voice was very quiet now. "I thought I would feel something. Relief, perhaps." "And did you?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Clark shook her head. "No," she said. "Only quiet." Miss Marple rose slowly. "I see," she said. Mrs. Clark looked at her. "Are you going to tell anyone?" she asked. Miss Marple regarded her thoughtfully. "That," she said, "is something I must consider very carefully." As she left the house, Miss Marple felt no sense of triumph, only a deep, quiet sadness. For what had happened was not the result of sudden anger or cruelty. It had grown, slowly and steadily, from something far more subtle: kindness, expectation, control, and at last, resistance. Miss Marple paused at the gate, her expression grave. "Yes," she murmured, "the night before had decided everything. And the consequences had been final." The question of justice, Miss Marple did not immediately return home. Instead, she walked slowly along the lane that curved away from Mrs. Clark's house, her steps measured, her hands folded lightly before her. The village lay quiet in the soft light of a late afternoon, as though unaware that anything had shifted beneath its surface. And yet Miss Marple knew that something had shifted, something profound and irreversible. The truth, once seen clearly, could not be unseen. She paused near the small footbridge at the edge of the meadow, a place she often found conducive to thought. The stream below moved gently, its steady course indifferent to human complications. Justice, Miss Marple reflected, was a curious thing. In books it was so often neat and decisive, the guilty revealed, the innocent vindicated, order restored. But in life, it was rarely so simple. Mrs. Clark had killed Mrs. Whitcomb. Of that Miss Marple felt no doubt, and yet she did not resemble the sort of murderer one expected. There had been no greed in her actions, no malice in the usual sense, no pleasure taken in the deed, only a quiet, desperate finality. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the flowing water. "Yes," she murmured, "desperation can be a very powerful motive." When she returned home, she found Florence waiting with a look of curiosity she was not attempting to conceal. "You've been out a long time, miss," she said. "Yes, Florence," Miss Marple replied calmly. "I have had several calls to make." Florence hovered for a moment, clearly hoping for further information. "They're still talking about Mrs. Whitcomb," she added, "saying what a loss she is." Miss Marple removed her gloves with deliberate care. "I imagine they are," she said. Florence hesitated. "Such a good lady," she said. "You don't often see the like." Miss Marple paused. "No," she said quietly, "one does not." That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting once again in her hands. The familiar motion of the needles brought a certain comfort, though her thoughts remained far from settled. There were, she knew, several possible courses of action. Yes, she could go to Dr. Haynes, or to the vicar, or even to the authorities in the nearest town. It would not be difficult to set the matter in motion. Mrs. Clark had not confessed outright, but she had come very near to it, and with a little pressure, the truth would emerge fully. Yes, it would be possible. And yet Miss Marple did not move. Instead, her mind returned to the faces she'd seen over the past few days. Mrs. Turner, uncertain, but faintly relieved. Mr. Ellis, grateful, though he would not have admitted it. Miss Hartwell, breathing a little more freely than before. even Mr. Briggs, who had feared losing his home. One by one they had all lived under Mrs. Whitcomb's careful attention, and now they were free of it. Miss Marple's needles slowed. Freedom, she thought, was not always recognised as such, not immediately. Sometimes it came disguised as loss. The following morning Miss Marple received another visitor. It was Mrs. Clark. She stood at the door, her expression composed but pale. "May I come in?" she asked. "Of course," Miss Marple replied. They sat together in the sitting room, the atmosphere quiet but not uncomfortable. "I thought about what you said," Mrs. Clark began. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes?" "I suppose it doesn't matter much now," Mrs. Clark said. "You know what happened?" Miss Marple said nothing. "I didn't plan it," Mrs. Clark continued, "not at first. But after that conversation, after she told me I would have to leave," her voice tightened slightly, "I realised she would go on, not just with me, with everyone." Miss Marple watched her steadily. "And you believed it was your responsibility to stop her?" she asked. Mrs. Clark hesitated. "No," she said at last. "Not my responsibility. Just something I couldn't endure any longer." There was a long pause. "I brought it with me," Mrs. Clark said quietly. "Something from Mr. Ellis's shop. He would never have noticed it missing. He trusted her too much." Miss Marple's eyes flickered very slightly. "And you gave it to her?" she asked. Mrs. Clark nodded. "In her tea," she said. "She never suspected. Why would she?" No, Miss Marple thought. Why would she? "She thanked me," Mrs. Clark went on, her voice distant now. "Even then, said I was always so dependable." Miss Marple's hand stilled. "Yes," she said softly. Mrs. Clark looked up at her. "I keep thinking I should feel worse," she said, "but I don't. Not in the way one expects." Miss Marple regarded her thoughtfully. "That is not uncommon," she said. Mrs. Clark gave a faint, almost bitter smile. "No," she said, "I suppose not." There was another silence. Then Mrs. Clark said, "What will you do?" Miss Marple met her gaze. "What do you think I should do?" she asked. Mrs. Clark looked away. "I don't know," she said. "Perhaps tell someone. That would be the proper thing." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "it would." Mrs. Clark's hands tightened in her lap. "I won't pretend I deserve anything else," she said. Miss Marple studied her for a long moment. "No," she said quietly, "I do not think you would." When Mrs. Clark left, Miss Marple remained seated for some time. The room was very still. The question before her was no longer one of fact, but of judgment. And judgment, she knew, required more than logic. It required understanding. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked once more through the village. Everything appeared entirely ordinary. Children played, shopkeepers arranged their goods, voices rose and fell in familiar patterns. Life, as always, continued. And yet, beneath it all, something had changed. Miss Marple paused outside Mrs. Whitcomb's cottage. The garden remained as neat as ever, though there was no one now to tend it with the same careful attention. "Yes," she murmured, "a great deal has changed." As she turned to leave, she noticed Mrs. Turner walking past, moving with slightly more confidence than before. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," she called. "Good afternoon," Miss Marple replied. Mrs. Turner hesitated, then said, "I've decided to manage my own affairs for a while. It will do me good, I think." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Yes," she said, "I believe it will." That evening Miss Marple made her decision. It was not one she took lightly, nor was it one she would ever speak of openly. But it was, she felt, the right one. She would say nothing. Not to the vicar, not to the doctor, not to anyone. Mrs. Whitcomb's death would remain, in the eyes of the village, a natural passing, a peaceful end to a life of kindness. And Mrs. Clark would live with what she had done. Miss Marple's gaze rested quietly on her knitting. "Yes," she said softly, "some things are punishment enough." And yet, even as she spoke the words, she knew that the matter was not entirely closed. For truth, once uncovered, had a way of lingering, of casting its own quiet shadow. And in St. Mary Mead, the shape of absence. In the weeks that followed, St. Mary Mead settled, as villages so often do, into a new and altered normal, though few would have described it in such terms. Outwardly, very little had changed. The same doors opened in the morning, the same paths were walked, the same greetings exchanged, and yet beneath that surface there was a subtle but undeniable shift. Mrs. Whitcomb's absence had not left a void in the way one might have expected. It had left space. Miss Marple observed it first in the smallest of ways. Mrs. Turner, for instance, no longer waited by her window on Tuesdays and Fridays. Instead, she could be seen venturing out more frequently, her steps slow but determined. There was a hesitancy in her movements, certainly, but also a quiet resolve. "I've taken to doing things for myself again," she told Miss Marple one morning with a mixture of pride and uncertainty. "It's not easy. But I suppose I'd grown out of the habit." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "Yes," she said, "habits can be very persuasive." Mrs. Turner gave a small laugh. "That they can," she agreed. At the chemist's shop, Mr. Ellis had begun keeping his own records with renewed diligence. His handwriting was untidy, and his system imperfect, but there was a certain satisfaction in his manner that had not been present before. "I've been meaning to organise things properly for years," he told Miss Marple. "Just never quite got around to it." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "And now you have," she said. "Yes," he replied. "Now I have." There was a pause. "Strange, isn't it?" he added. "One would have thought I'd feel the loss more keenly." Miss Marple's eyes rested on him thoughtfully. "Yes," she said, "one might have thought so." Miss Hartwell, too, showed signs of quiet transformation. Miss Marple found her one afternoon in her garden, attempting, with limited success, to prune a rosebush. "I'm afraid I'm making rather a mess of it," she said apologetically. Miss Marple regarded the uneven cuts with gentle amusement. "Practice improves such things," she said. "Yes," Miss Hartwell replied, "and I suppose I must learn, mustn't I?" There was a lightness in her voice that had not been there before. "I feel rather capable," she added, almost in surprise. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," she said, "that is a pleasant feeling." It was not that the villagers had ceased to speak of Mrs. Whitcomb. On the contrary, her name was still mentioned frequently, always with affection, always with admiration. "She was so good to us. Such a kind heart. We were lucky to have her." These sentiments were repeated often and sincerely. But Miss Marple noticed something else, a certain carefulness, a slight hesitation, as though the memory of Mrs. Whitcomb, though cherished, was being handled with increasing delicacy. Only Mrs. Clark remained unchanged, or rather, she appeared so. She continued her daily routines with the same efficiency as before. Her house was as orderly, her manner as composed. She spoke of Mrs. Whitcomb with appropriate respect, neither too much nor too little. But Miss Marple, who watched closely, saw the difference. It was there in the stillness, in the way Mrs. Clark paused sometimes in the middle of a task, as though her thoughts had momentarily slipped beyond her control. It was there in her eyes too, not guilt, exactly, but awareness, a constant unspoken awareness of what lay beneath the surface of things. One afternoon, as Miss Marple sat in her garden, she saw Mrs. Clark approaching along the path. There was nothing hurried in her manner, but there was purpose in it. "Miss Marple," she said when she reached the gate, "may I speak with you?" "Of course," Miss Marple replied. They sat together in the soft sunlight, the air warm and still. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Mrs. Clark said, "Things are different." Miss Marple regarded her calmly. "Yes," she said, "they are." Mrs. Clark clasped her hands together. "I thought it would feel like relief," she said, "and in some ways it does." Miss Marple waited. "But not in the way I expected," Mrs. Clark continued. "It's quieter than that." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "I imagine it would be." There was a long pause. "They're all managing," Mrs. Clark said at last. "Better than before in some cases." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes." Mrs. Clark looked down at her hands. She would have said it was because of her, she added, that she had prepared them. Miss Marple's lips curved very slightly. "Yes," she said, "I think she might have." Mrs. Clark gave a faint, humourless smile. "And perhaps she would have believed it," she said. Miss Marple did not disagree. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was, in a curious way, honest. "I sometimes wonder," Mrs. Clark said slowly, "whether I did what I did for myself, or for them." Miss Marple considered this. "I think," she said carefully, "and that such distinctions are rarely clear." Mrs. Clark nodded. "Yes," she said. "That's what I thought." A breeze stirred the flowers in the garden, carrying with it the faint scent of roses. Miss Marple's gaze drifted for a moment, then returned. "Do you regret it?" she asked. Mrs. Clark did not answer immediately. "I regret that it came to that," she said at last, "but not that it ended." Miss Marple studied her quietly. "Yes," she said. After Mrs. Clark had gone, Miss Marple remained seated for some time. The village sounds drifted faintly through the air, voices, footsteps, the distant clatter of a cart. Life, as always, continued, and yet Miss Marple could not help but reflect on the curious nature of absence. Mrs. Whitcomb had been everywhere, in every household, in every small difficulty. Her presence had been constant, reassuring, undeniable, and now in her absence something else had emerged. Not chaos, as one might have expected, not even hardship, but independence. Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more. "Yes," she murmured, "a space has been made." But space, she knew, was not always an unqualified good. It allowed for growth, certainly, but it also allowed for reflection, and reflection, in time, could lead to understanding. The truth of what had happened had not been spoken, not openly, not in any way that could be acknowledged or addressed, but it lingered, nonetheless, in the slight changes in conversation, in the new patterns of behaviour, in the quiet, unspoken recognition that something significant had shifted. Miss Marple's needles moved steadily, her expression thoughtful. "Yes," she said softly, "the shape of absence." It was not merely what was gone that mattered, but what remained. And in Street, Mary Mead, what remained was something far more complex than simple grief. It was freedom, it was unease, it was memory, and perhaps most importantly, it was the beginning of understanding. Whispers beneath politeness. If there was one thing Miss Marple understood better than most, it was that truth, no matter how carefully concealed, had a way of rising gently to the surface, not in the form of accusation or scandal, but as something far subtler, a hesitation, a glance, a sentence left unfinished. And in St. Mary Mead, where conversation was both art and occupation, such things did not go unnoticed forever. It began, as many things did, at the tea table. Mrs. Price Ridley, who prided herself on her discernment, had invited a small group for afternoon tea, a gathering that included Miss Marple, Mrs. Turner and Miss Hartwell. The conversation, as expected, turned sooner rather than later to Mrs. Whitcomb. "One cannot help but feel her absence," Mrs. Price Ridley declared, stirring her tea with unnecessary emphasis. "The village is not quite the same." "No," Miss Hartwell agreed, "not quite the same." There was a pause. "But people are managing," Mrs. Turner added, a little more firmly than necessary. Mrs. Price Ridley raised an eyebrow. "Managing?" she repeated. "Yes," Mrs. Turner said. "One must, after all." Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing, noted the slight tension in her voice. "Yes," she said gently, "one must." Mrs. Price Ridley leaned forward slightly. "I do sometimes wonder," she said, lowering her voice just enough to suggest discretion while ensuring she was still heard, "whether we perhaps relied upon her too much." Miss Hartwell looked down at her teacup. "I have wondered that myself," she admitted. Mrs. Turner hesitated. "Well, she did like to be helpful," she said. There it was again, that careful phrasing. Miss Marple's eyes flickered with quiet interest. "Yes," she said, "she did." The conversation moved on, as it inevitably would, but something had shifted. It was not spoken outright. It never would be. But the tone had changed. Mrs. Whitcomb was still remembered kindly, but no longer unquestioningly. Over the next few days, Miss Marple noticed similar moments elsewhere. At the grocer's, where two women paused mid-conversation as she approached, then resumed in slightly altered tones. At the post office, where Mr. Ellis remarked almost to himself, "One does like to make one's own decisions. After all." Even at the vicarage, where the vicar, in a moment of unusual candour, said, "It is possible, I think, for even the best intentions to become rather overwhelming." Miss Marple had inclined her head in agreement. "Yes," she had said, "very possible." It was, Miss Marple reflected, the beginning of a kind of collective realisation, not dramatic, not confrontational, but steady. The villagers were, in their own way, reinterpreting their memories, revisiting past interactions with new understanding, and in doing so they were adjusting, not only to Mrs. Whitcomb's absence, but to the truth of her presence. One afternoon, Miss Marple found herself once again walking past Mrs. Whitcomb's cottage. The garden, though still orderly, had begun to show signs of neglect. A few weeds had crept in among the flower beds. The tulips, once so perfectly upright, had begun to droop. It was not disorder, not yet, but it was change. Miss Marple paused at the gate, her gaze thoughtful. "Yes," she murmured, "nothing remains exactly as it was." Her reflections were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. It was Mr. Briggs. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said. "Good afternoon," she replied. He glanced toward the cottage. "Strange, isn't it?" he said. "To think she's gone." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Very strange." Mr. Briggs hesitated. "I've been thinking about what she said to me," he continued. "About moving." Miss Marple regarded him quietly. "And how do you feel about that now?" she asked. He considered for a moment. "At the time, I was quite upset," he admitted. "It felt unfair. And now?" He gave a small shrug. "Now, I suppose I'm glad nothing came of it," he said. "I rather like my house as it is." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes," she said, "I imagine you do." There was a brief silence. Then Mr. Briggs said, "Do you think she really believed she was doing the right thing?" Miss Marple's gaze returned to the cottage. "Yes," she said, "I believe she did." Mr. Briggs nodded slowly. "That's the curious part," he said. "It makes it harder to know how one ought to feel." Miss Marple did not reply at once. "No," she said at last, "it does." As evening approached, Miss Marple returned home with a growing sense that the matter, though unspoken, was reaching a kind of quiet resolution. The truth had not been revealed. No accusations had been made, and yet understanding was spreading, not in the form of certainty, but in the form of questions. And sometimes, she reflected, questions were far more powerful than answers. That night, as she sat by her fire, Miss Marple found herself thinking once more of Mrs. Clark. The woman had withdrawn slightly from village life, not noticeably enough to attract comment, but enough that Miss Marple could see the pattern. She attended to her duties. She spoke when spoken to. But there was a distance now, a carefulness, as though she were constantly measuring her place in the world. Miss Marple's expression softened. "Yes," she murmured. "Understanding comes in many forms." She picked up her knitting, her hands moving with quiet precision. The pattern was nearly complete now. Only a few rows remained. It was, she thought, rather like the case itself. All the threads were in place, all the pieces aligned. Nothing more needed to be said. And yet, Miss Marple paused, her needle still. There was one final element. Not a fact, not a detail, but a truth. A truth that, though unspoken, had shaped everything that had occurred. Kindness, she reflected, was not always gentle. It could be insistent, persistent, even in its own way, forceful. And when it crossed that delicate boundary, when it ceased to offer and began to impose, it became something else entirely, something heavier, something that demanded a response. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her expression calm. "Yes," she said softly, "even the gentlest lives can cast long shadows." And in St. Mary Mead, those shadows were only just beginning to be understood. What remains unsaid. By the time early summer settled fully over St. Mary Mead, the memory of Mrs. Whitcomb had taken on that particular quality reserved for the dead, softened at the edges, shaped carefully by recollection, and in certain respects made more comfortable than truth might allow. It was not that the villagers had forgotten her. Far from it. They remembered her often, and always with a kind of deliberate gentleness, as though handling something fragile. But they no longer spoke of her quite in the same way. Miss Marple noticed it most clearly during a small gathering at the vicarage one warm afternoon. The windows stood open, allowing in the scent of cut grass and distant roses, and a modest group had assembled for tea. The conversation, as it inevitably did, turned toward the subject of Mrs. Whitcomb. She had such a gift, the vicar's wife said, for knowing exactly what people needed. There was a murmur of agreement. "Yes," Miss Hartwell said. She was very perceptive. A pause followed. "Though, perhaps," A little too certain at times, Mr. Ellis added, almost apologetically. The room grew very slightly still. Miss Marple, seated quietly near the window, did not look up, but she listened. Mrs. Turner cleared her throat. "Well, we all have our ways," she said. "Yes," the vicar replied gently. "We do indeed." The conversation moved on, but the moment lingered. It was not contradiction, not disagreement, but something more delicate, an adjustment. Later, as the guests began to disperse, Miss Marple found herself walking alongside the vicar in the garden. "A remarkable woman," he said thoughtfully. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. He hesitated. "I have been reflecting," he continued, "on the nature of influence. It is a curious thing." "Is it not?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "In what way?" she asked. "Well," he said, "it can be a force for great good, and yet it must be exercised with care." Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. "Yes," she said, "with great care." They walked a little further in silence. "There are times," the vicar went on, "when one wishes to guide, to help, to prevent others from making mistakes." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "but one must allow them to live their own lives," he added quietly. Miss Marple looked at him. "Yes," she said, "one must." As she returned home that evening, Miss Marple felt a certain quiet satisfaction. Not because the truth had been spoken, it had not, and it never would be, but because something very close to it had been understood. An understanding, she knew, was often more enduring than fact. Old Clark came to see her once more a few days later. There was a different quality about her now, not lighter, precisely, but steadier. "Things have settled," she said, taking her usual seat. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "they have." Mrs. Clark folded her hands. "No one suspects," she said. It was not a question. "No," Miss Marple said. There was a pause. "And you will not tell them," Mrs. Clark added. Miss Marple regarded her calmly. "No," she said, "I will not." Mrs. Clark exhaled slowly. "I don't know whether to be grateful," she said, "or ashamed." Miss Marple's expression remained gentle. "Perhaps both," she said. Mrs. Clark gave a faint, weary smile. "Yes," she said, "that sounds about right." They sat in silence for a moment. "I have been thinking about her," Mrs. Clark said at last. Not as she was, but as she believed herself to be. Miss Marple listened. "She thought she was helping," Mrs. Clark continued. "She thought she was making things better." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "I believe she did." Mrs. Clark nodded. "That's what makes it difficult," she said. Miss Marple set aside her knitting. "Yes," she said softly, "it does." There was one question left, one that neither of them had yet addressed. It came, at last, quietly. "Do you think," Mrs. Clark said, "that I was wrong?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. She looked out of the window where the late afternoon light lay gently across the garden. When she spoke, her voice was calm but very precise. "Yes," she said, "I do." Mrs. Clark did not flinch. "I thought you might," she said. Miss Marple turned back to her. "To take a life," she continued, "is always wrong." Mrs. Clark nodded slowly. "Yes," she said, "I know that." There was no condemnation in Miss Marple's tone, only clarity. "But," she added, "it is also possible to understand why such a thing was done." Mrs. Clark's eyes met hers. "Yes," she said, "that matters." They did not speak further of it. There was nothing more to say. After Mrs. Clark had gone, Miss Marple remained seated for some time. The light faded gradually, the garden slipping into shadow. Yes, she thought, that was the truth of it. Not innocence, not guilt alone, but something far more complicated. The village would remember Mrs. Whitcomb as she had appeared. Kind, attentive, generous beyond measure. They would speak of her with warmth. They would honour her memory, and that, Miss Marple reflected, was not entirely wrong. Oh, but neither was it entirely right. Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more, her hands moving slowly now. "There are many kinds of truth," she murmured. "Some were spoken, others were lived, and some remained quietly between those who understood." In St. Mary Mead, life had returned to its gentle rhythm, but beneath that rhythm something had shifted, something subtle but lasting. A greater awareness, a quieter independence, a recognition, perhaps, that even the best intentions must be held lightly. Miss Marple's needles paused. "Yes," she said softly, "what remains unsaid is often what matters most. And in this case, what remained unsaid would shape the village far more than any revelation ever could. The long shadow of kindness." In the fullness of summer, Saint, Mary Mead appeared, once again, to be precisely what it had always been. The hedgerows were thick with green, the gardens bright with colour, and the steady rhythm of village life carried on with reassuring familiarity. To an outsider, there would have been nothing to suggest that anything of consequence had occurred at all, and yet, for those who had lived through it, something had undeniably changed. Not in any dramatic or visible way, but quietly, permanently. Miss Marple, seated in her garden one warm afternoon, observed it all with her usual calm attention. Her knitting rested lightly in her hands, though she had paused in her work, her gaze directed toward the lane beyond. It was a peaceful scene. Mrs. Turner passed by, walking more steadily than she had in months. She paused briefly at the gate. "Good afternoon." "Miss Marple," she said. "Good afternoon, my dear," Miss Marple replied. "I've been to the shops," Mrs. Turner added, with a note of modest pride. "Managed quite well, I think," Miss Marple smiled. "I am sure you did." Mrs. Turner nodded, then continued on her way. A little later, Miss Hartwell could be seen in her garden, carefully tending to her roses. The results were still somewhat uneven, but there was confidence in her movements now, an ease that had not been there before. Further along, Mr. Ellis stood outside his shop, speaking with a customer, his manner composed and self-assured. Each of them, Miss Marple reflected, had adjusted. Not perfectly, but sufficiently. It was, perhaps, the greatest irony of all, that the absence of one so devoted to caring for others had allowed those very people to begin caring for themselves. Miss Marple's fingers moved slowly over her knitting. "Yes," she murmured, "life has a way of restoring its balance." And yet she did not allow herself to forget. For beneath that balance lay the truth, quiet, unspoken, but no less real. Mrs. Whitcomb had been, in every outward sense, a good woman. She had given her time, her energy, her attention. She had been generous, thoughtful, unfailingly kind. But she had also, without fully realizing it, shaped the lives of others in ways that left little room for independence. She had created a world in which she was necessary, indispensable, and in doing so she had cast a shadow far longer than she ever intended. Miss Marple's gaze drifted briefly to Mrs. Whitcomb's cottage. It stood much as it always had, though now it belonged to someone new, a quiet couple who had come from another village. They had begun to tend the garden in their own way, allowing certain things to grow freely where once everything had been carefully ordered. It was not untidy, but it was different, more natural. Miss Marple approved. As the afternoon wore on, she found herself reflecting, not for the first time, on Mrs. Clark. The woman remained in the village as she always had. She had not withdrawn entirely, but neither had she returned to her former place within the fabric of daily life. There was a distance about her now, a self-containment. She spoke politely. She fulfilled her responsibilities, but there was a quietness in her that had not been there before, a stillness that suggested not peace, but acceptance. Miss Marple had not spoken of what she knew, nor would she. It was not, she felt, a matter for public judgment. The law, she knew, dealt in actions. But life, real life, required something more nuanced, understanding, context, human nature. She thought again of that final conversation. "Do you think I was wrong?" Yes. The answer had been simple, because it had to be. Some truths admitted no compromise, and yet, to acknowledge that something was wrong was not the same as failing to understand it. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her hands steady, her thoughts clear. Justice, she reflected, had not been served in the conventional sense. No trial had taken place, no verdict had been delivered, and yet there had been consequences. Mrs. Clark would carry her knowledge for the rest of her life, not openly, not in a way that others would see, but quietly, constantly. And perhaps that, in its own way, was a form of justice. The village, too, had learned something, though it might never have put it into words. There was a greater caution now in the way people offered help, a subtle awareness of boundaries, a recognition perhaps that even kindness must allow space for refusal. Miss Marple had noticed it in the smallest interactions, a question asked rather than an assumption made, an offer given rather than imposed. It was a change so slight as to be almost invisible, and yet it mattered. The sun began to lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the garden. Miss Marple paused, her eyes following the line of one such shadow as it stretched across the grass. "Yes," she said softly, "shadows." They were not always dark, not always ominous, but they revealed shape, depth, perspective. Mrs. Whitcomb's life had been, by all appearances, a gentle one, full of care, full of giving. But even the gentlest lives, Miss Marple knew, could leave behind consequences that were not immediately visible. Influence lingered, habits persisted, and the effects of one person's presence, however well-intentioned, could extend far beyond what was ever intended. Miss Marple set her knitting aside at last. The pattern was complete. She examined it briefly, then folded it neatly. "There," she murmured, "finished." But she knew, as she rose and made her way slowly back inside, that some things were never truly finished. They simply settled, into memory, into understanding, into the quiet spaces between what was said and what was known. That evening, as the village lights flickered on one by one, St. Mary Mead seemed as tranquil as ever. No one spoke of murder. No one questioned the past too closely. And yet, and beneath that calm surface, something enduring remained. A lesson, perhaps, or simply a recognition. Miss Marple, seated once more by her fire, allowed herself a small, thoughtful smile. "Yes," she said softly, "even kindness must be given with care." Conclusion. The death of Mrs. Whitcomb would in time become just another story in the long history of St. Mary Mead, a tale of a kind and generous woman who passed peacefully in her home, leaving behind a grateful village. And perhaps that was how it ought to be remembered. But for Miss Marple, and for one other, it would always be something more. A reminder that human nature is rarely simple, that goodness, when carried too far, can become something heavier than it appears, and that even the most gentle influence, if left unchecked, can shape lives in ways that are not always kind. In the end, no one spoke the truth aloud, but it was understood. And sometimes, Miss Marple thought, understanding was the most honest form of truth there was,